Hey everybody, OperationZ here, and we're on Joseph's story, part 6 now. And we leave off where we're in part 5, and pretty much all these things happen where, the tension is so thick towards Joseph that you couldn't cut the air around him with a knife, that they were so hostile towards Joseph, and they were so just, there was so much anger because of these dreams he had, but also their whole life, pretty much Joseph being treated better with more love and care and attention from their father Jacob than all the rest of them. And they were just to do what they were supposed to do, tending to his herds and his flocks. And, you know, Joseph got all the care and attention and just nurture from his father opposed to all of them. And they were all very jealous, and there was tension towards that. And we just know that, like, why wouldn't they be jealous if it's their father? And basically just to be loved equally, right? That's just the mindset about it. But because he's that son of Rachel, that firstborn son of Rachel, he gets that elevated status, that coat of many collars, and all these things. And they see him coming to Dothan, and they just, they lose it towards him. And again, God means it all for peace in the end. But where they were going to do something a lot worse towards Joseph, pretty much Reuben is very level-headed, and he tells the brethren, hey, you all do not do this. Just take them and throw them into this pit. Teach them a lesson, and that's what Reuben says to do, and they do it. But then these Midianite merchantmen come, which are also Ishmaelite traders, and they come in and they see him, and Judah gets this idea, and he says, well, hey, what would it profit us if we kill Joseph, our brother? How's about instead we just take him and we sell him and we get some money off of him? And all the brothers think it's a great idea to do that because they're so angry at him. And they go to the Ishmaelite traders. They sell him for 20 pieces of silver. They pull him out of the pit and they take him with them, and then they sell him onto Egypt. And that's where we leave off, and we're going to see what happens as we continue here in verse 31. So Genesis chapter 37, verse 31 says this, and they took Joseph's coat and killed a kid of the goats and dipped the coat in the blood. So basically they took that coat that they stripped from him, the coat of many collars. They killed one of the goats and they dipped it in blood, because their intentions and their purposes are to deceive their father and make it look like some wild beast out in the field caught him in the way and slayed him, which we know not to be the case. In verse 22, and they sent the coat of many collars, and they brought it to their father, and said, this have we found. Know now whether it be thy son's coat or no. And, basically, there's all kinds of wild beasts that really could have killed Joseph. And, their father Jacob was not privy to it, because he knows full well, too, that in this area that they're at, there's mountain lions out there. Closer to Egypt and areas like that, there's all kinds of wild jackals, and bears, and just all these things like that. So it could have been some kind of wild beast that was a man-eater, and it just took upon himself to eat Joseph, and leave nothing but that coat. And this didn't happen because the brethren deceived their father. That it was all a ruse and it didn't actually happen, but it is a likelihood, being out in the wilderness, that it could happen. Again, when we look back to Lot's story, when they have to flee from Sodom, where their house is and all that stuff, that he asked the angels that are with him, and he said, well, here, I don't want to go into some cave unless some evil befall me. Again, that's talking about pretty much just the dangerous wildlife in the area. You got some pretty fierce beasts that like to go in caves and whatnot, and around the area. So he wanted to go and flee to pretty much a smaller little settlement or place to go to. That, I think it was the city, I think it was Zor, but they ended up going there instead, and God didn't overthrow that area with Sodom and Gomorrah. And but that right there, it's the same thing with the wildlife, because they got mountain lions in some parts where they're at, and then in some parts there's the actual, in this time frame, Asiatic lions, which they don't actually thrive in Israel anymore because they're a very endangered species. Like the Asiatic lions are pretty much, they're not like the Saharan lion with the full beard or full mane, as you would say, but their ears, you can actually see their ears because it's not a full mane, and it is more like a beard than a mane in a way. But you can see that with them, and that's what the male lions, not the lionesses, of course, but with the male lions like that, that's what they look like. It's not like the Saharan lions that you find out in Africa and all that. But they had the Asiatic lions, which you can only find in one or two little spots in Indonesia now. They're highly endangered big cats. But in this time frame, they weren't extinct, and they populated the area heavily. And it could have been them, or mountain lions, jackals, you name it. But we're going to continue where we leave off in the story. And Genesis chapter 37, verse 32. That's what we just read. And then 33, and he knew it and said, it is my son's coat, an evil beast hath devoured him. Joseph is without doubt rent in pieces. So they got Jacob believing, Joseph has pretty much been torn in pieces by jackals, or probably wolves in the area, or it could have been a bear, it could have been some kind of lion, it could have been anything. And he just knows his son is no more, and this torn up coat that he's given him is all that they found of him. Like, that's all that would come up out of that they think, basically Jacob thinks he's pretty much been just completely mauled by some wild beast. And that's what Joseph's brethren allowed Jacob, not allowed, but that's what they deceive him with believing. And Genesis chapter 37, verse 33, and he knew it and said, it is my son's coat, an evil beast hath devoured him. Yeah, we read that. Without doubt, rent in pieces. So Genesis chapter 37, verse 34 says this, "And Jacob rent his clothes and put sackcloth upon his loins and mourned for his son many days." So again, like where we talked about in the other video with renting the clothes, or like where he rent his clothes, or it's basically ripping them up, tearing them apart. And it says he mourned many days, and he put sackcloth upon his loins. So something else he was doing with that was he was also, because he was mourning, he was also fasting, which is one of their customs that, and sometimes when people get really depressed too, they just stop eating for a few days because they don't want to eat nothing. They can't stomach it because they're so depressed and upset. But, the fasting too, when they do it, it's a spiritual thing. And whenever whoever would do it, if they're doing it for that intent and purpose, it's like that. But they're just so sad. Like, he's so sad because he lost Joseph, the beloved firstborn son of Rachel, who he loved more than all of his other wives. Pretty much he was mourning so much so that he wasn't eating, and he was just distraught. Put sackcloth upon him and the ashes on his face, and just that's what they would do. That's how they mourned. And because it does say right here, put the sackcloth upon, basically upon himself. And that was just something that they did when they mourned. And the reason they put this sackcloth upon themselves is pretty much it's a humbling thing. Like, they humble themselves by doing that. They take off the clothes they're wearing and they just put that on, and they mourn in it. But that's where we're at right there. Genesis chapter 37, verse 34. "And Jacob rent his clothes and put sackcloth upon his loins and mourned for his son many days." So again, we just read that. But Genesis chapter 37, verse 35, "And all of his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, For I will go down into the grave unto my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him." So, "For I will go down into the grave unto my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him." It just shows how much Jacob really loved his son. And he'd probably do the same thing for his other sons too. It's not that he doesn't love all of his many sons that he has, and whatnot, but Joseph is just that really special son to him, because with Joseph, all the memories of his beloved Rachel were tied in with Joseph. And, he's just mourning and weeping and just so distraught because he lost that son and that connection to Rachel that they had when they had their first son together and their first child together. And Benjamin's still there, which then he pretty much clings to Benjamin, and that's actually how, if we would look back at Jacob's story, that's actually how he loses Rachel, because it was complications during childbirth, and they didn't really have like the high-end doctors and stuff that we have now back then. So if complications happened during childbirth, then it's more than likely that they would die like Rachel did in that case. and she just couldn't handle bearing Benjamin, that second son. And the thing is, she was just so distressed and in pain and agony that she wanted to name him Benani, which means pretty much child of sorrow. That's what that name Benani means. But, you know, Jacob pretty much takes her by the hands and says, no, we're going to name him Benjamin, which means child of joy. And it was a very sad thing, though, because soon after that, she takes her last breath and Rachel dies. And what's even more sad is Abraham had this cave in Machpelah that, pretty much that's where all of their dead was supposed to be buried. That's where Leah ends up getting buried. And that's where Jacob is taken to when he dies later on. And that's where Joseph declares he wants his bones to go and whatnot when he dies. And, when they finally come out of Egypt, that was his request for what would happen to him, that pretty much they would take his bones and carry it and go to that cave, the cave of Machpelah, which they purchased from the Hittites, the sons of Heth. But Rachel, because they weren't conveniently nowhere near that area, they just had to pretty much bury her on the side of the road. But I think she ends up getting a sepulcher of where she was buried, which is basically kind of like a burial tomb later on, which I don't know how that came about, but Jacob just pretty much buries her, and on the road on the way to where he's going. And, we just see that pretty much it's just a sad thing that this happens, and they got, he lost Joseph, so now he clings to Benjamin, his child of joy, which, is the last son that he has from Rachel, who he loves so much. And that's just where we're at right there. But we pick up where we leave off. I think we are in Pt.6 now, and that's the last verse that we'll read for this video. But, and the Midianites sold him into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and captain of the guard. So Potiphar, pretty much Joseph ends up being taken as Potiphar's slave. And where it says he's captain of the guard of Pharaoh, that's a very highly prestigious position that Potiphar has, that, he's very high ranking in that Egyptian hierarchy, that, he has a bunch of servants and he has a whole lot of slaves for building purposes and whatnot, and pretty much just building all these things and in his property, that they would conveniently buy slaves to do and force the labor upon them. And that's what Joseph ends up getting put through for, a little bit in his life there when he's a slave of Potiphar. But, that's where he's at right now. And, he's pretty much just a slave to Potiphar along with all the other slaves that he had. But he was pretty much, Potiphar was very high ranking, and that's just where, you know, like that's why he's got all this property and the slaves and all this stuff that he's got. And Joseph, that's the situation that he's currently in, that, it's something that looks pretty hopeless. Like, the way it looks like to him is he's just going to be a slave for the rest of his life. But, instead of moping about it and being miserable about his life circumstances all day, every day, he keeps his chin up, so to speak. And where he's in this awful situation, he in his heart has his hope set upon God, and with his God in mind, and we see it. He hasn't forsaken his faith in God, and he didn't say, oh, well, my God's surely not here because this is the land of Egypt. No, he knew better, that God was still with him because of the things he says in the text later on. And, that's just some very noteworthy stuff to take into consideration. But that's the story for today, and you all have a blessed day.